I'm very annoyed. Hey babes in Bookland. I have just completed reading Monstress by Marjorie Liu. This was illustrated by Sana Takeda. It was published in 2016. It was met with tons of critical acclaim, tons of praise, tons of celebration, and I have no idea why. When the story first opens, we meet Micah Halfwolf, who is being sold or traded for reasons unknown. She is sold or traded into captivity, eventually escapes to find a friend of hers that she was separated from, and also to avenge her mother's death while being hunted by a couple of different groups of people, and meanwhile having this ancient monster spirit god take up residence in her body. Also, we find out later on that there is a civil war that has occurred between humans and the Arcana, which I believe are half human, half animal, but possess a mystical power or some sort of divinity that kind of sets the two species at odds with each other. I think I got all of that right. Which brings me to my first point. When you're dropped into the middle of this story, it's very clear that there are things that have happened before you got there. That's fine. What's not fine is that it doesn't do a very good job of setting you up for this, nor explaining why certain things are happening. So because of this absence of information, it makes the violence and the suffering and the subjugation and the oppression that's happening in the story seem very out of place because you have no context for why any of these things are occurring. Normally this wouldn't bother me in a series, except that it takes so long to even get to a point where they explain stuff to you. And also, the story is very top heavy. It's attempting to squeeze all of this information into a medium that is designed for very concise storytelling. And I think this was one of the things that this book got wrong, was that it attempted to explain so much of the lore while in the story that it crowded it. It made it way too stuffed. And I think what could have been very helpful in this situation is including a prologue where the author could explain more about the world and explain more about this war and explain more about the relationship between the humans and Arcanics, so that you weren't having to find out all this stuff along the way. I think there would have still been enough material to have things be revealed and to be able to retain some mystery about the story. Unfortunately, I think the author kind of misused the medium in that way, where it could have been a much quieter story and a little less chaotic with the dialogue, and instead it just was so overwhelming and confusing. And the writing was very bad. The dialogue just was terrible. It just didn't seem like there was any genuine communication between the characters. They were all just sort of talking at each other instead of having conversations. It didn't possess a lot of texture. There just wasn't a lot of genuine conversation between the characters. Everybody was just proclaiming and demanding, and that just gets really repetitive after a while. I also found the layout of this to be really chaotic. There were just these parts in here. I'll show you this one, for instance, where there were just so much action shots and so much talking over the action shots. And like this part in particular, I feel like just got really, really messy. There was just so much stuff going on and so much overlay. And it was just really, really uncomfortable to read. It was difficult to know where to focus your attention, who you should be paying attention to. Also, one of the things structurally I had some problems with were the Professor Tauntaun parts or whatever. And so in this world, cats are sort of the keepers of the knowledge. They're the ones that have the most in-depth knowledge about the wars and the evolution and the relationships between these creatures, between the races. And so, for instance, so here's one of the panels with Professor Tam Tam. And look at this. There's 16 bubbles, 16 speech bubbles that are on this page. That is excessive. That is way too many. Again, I think this book would have been served better by just having pages that you could read, pages that kind of explained what these things were rather than trying to make it bubbly and trying to make it fun. And I understand the purpose is to kind of take you out of the story a little bit, to be able to explain some lore and some background information, but it was just so annoying. It was very, very irritating. One of the things that this book got praised for was the world building. And I'm going to have to respectfully disagree on that. I think that, to borrow a phrase from Jeremy at Off the Shelf with Nashville Public Libraries, he was discussing once the difference between world building versus world built. I believe that there are certain authors who are able to do world built very, very well. I think, of course, Tolkien is one of those people. George R.R. Martin is somebody who knows the lore and the background, and they know the worlds that they created forward, backwards, upside down, inside out. They know everything about the world that they're writing characters in. And I don't think that Monstress possesses that knowledge. As you're reading the story, you again just get very disoriented. You don't know where you are in space. You don't know where these people came from. You don't know where these characters reside. You don't know what their background stories is. And of course, that's a lot of stuff to try to squeeze into a volume, but there are people who've been able to achieve it, and this is not one of those books that was able to do it. The characters were extremely brittle also. And Chris at Chris Bookish Cauldron made this point as well, that he just didn't care about any of the characters. The author didn't do a good job of making you care about anybody, so that when the defeats happened, when the triumphs occurred, you don't know who to attribute them to. They're sort of these orphaned accomplishments. That's a very unfortunate trait to have in a very clearly character-centered story. Now, I think one of the biggest things that draws people to this book is the artwork, and it is no doubt the strongest point of Monstress. You cannot dispute the fact that Sana Takeda is an extremely talented illustrator and artist, and that the drawings are very intricate. They're very detailed. There's a lot of texture. There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of really, really rich panels, and she's very good at illustrating action. I think that one of the cool things about this is that the artwork style is very Geiger-esque. There's a lot of, I think, heavy Geiger influences. I see a lot of Junji Ito influences there, and very clearly a lot of H.P. Lovecraft inspired monsters and illustrations. So my frustrations reside in a couple of places. First of all, I do think that there was some high art trickery involved in this. The author was relying very heavily on the artwork to trick you into thinking that what you were reading was cooler than what it was. And I don't buy that. I think that that's a very dishonest way to write a book. I think that the artwork absolutely carries this story, and if you were to strip all the artwork away, the story would not stand up on its own. It would not be something that I think people would be invested in reading, because it's just a poorly written story. And I think another part of it that frustrates me so much is that there's so many wonderful comic book authors out there and illustrators who work together, who have a true partnership, and authors that work extremely hard churning out these very quality stories that are human stories, that are truthful stories, that reveal something important about humans and their relationship and their interactions in the world. You know, and I think that this is all PR. I think this is all a result of a good PR team. So if any part of the team that had anything to do with Monstress is celebrated, it should be the clearly remarkable PR team that was assembled to hype up this book. It's unreal the amount of press that this book got that most comic book artists don't get. I mean, even some of the bigger releases at the larger comic book houses don't have nearly the press coverage that this book did. So, and on top of that, there weren't very many negative reviews. So that raises some red flags for me. Be suspect when there's a book of this quality that's out that's not getting very many negative reviews. Unfortunately, the reviews on YouTube that I saw, everybody was willing to admit that the writing was bad, that the dialogue was bad, but people were willing to overlook that because the artwork was so good. And that's not okay. Like, you know, comic books are still a form of storytelling. It's still a medium of storytelling, and bad dialogue can't be overlooked for good artwork. That's not a bar that we should be setting for any medium of storytelling. Ultimately, I'd like to close with this. If this was your first foray into comic books or any sort of graphic novel medium, don't feel like this is as good as it gets, because it's not. Be willing to try everything. Be willing to read everything. Be willing to go into your local comic book shop or to a library and talk to people who read different types of comic books. Go find comic book authors and artists who really resonate with you, who can tell your kind of story. So with that, thank you guys for watching. Please let me know your thoughts on this. Please leave some comments down in the comment section if you have opposing thoughts, if you agree with any of these things. I'm always, again, open to having my mind changed about these things. So if there's some insight that you can provide me with this story, I'm all ears. So thank you guys again, and I'll see you soon. Bye.